Hello, everyone. We'll give it about 3 more minutes to make sure everyone's on. Until then, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. I would suggest we get started now. Welcome to what says, final priorities and Spark Executive Committee funding request. I could say this is the last session of the panel, although I've experienced enough in my career to know never say never. But the thought is that this is a point at which we have taken the input of the group as well as overlaid the strategy and come up with a draft of the funding request based on everyone's input. With that being said, before we dive into it and kind of review where we are in the process and what that looks like, just wanted to open it up to the chairs, Senator Peterson or Melinda Stanley, in terms of if you want to give any thoughts as we go into this discussion.
Well, I would just like to take an opportunity to thank everyone who has been serving on the panel for their work and their feedback and their diligence in creating opportunities for Kansans to get connected. So, and obviously I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning as well. So thanks for the opportunity, John.
Thanks. Senator Peterson. We can't hear you, Senator Peterson. Oh, great, can hear you now.
There we go. It's trying to stay on mute. This computer has some issues.
Oh,
well, thank you for everyone for all the hard work and all the homework you've done, and be sure to get your input in and continue to provide input. Thank you.
Oh, you went back on mute, Senator Peterson.
That's fine. I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Okay.
This thing's giving me issues.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay, well, let's get into it. And we'll kind of review where we are and once again, open to discussion around any of this as we go through it. So this is going to be an abbreviated session, an hour. I give a little bit of an overview as to where we are in the process and then really spend the bulk of the time, talking through where things came out in terms of the programmatic investments for Spark funding requests and then talk about the next steps. Two things. One thing to keep in mind is that this is a little bit different even going into it than the other advisory panels, and that this is really more of an integrated strategy than something as broad as healthcare and education and economic revitalization. And it's coming on the heels of the Kansas broadband strategy. And so a lot of this work was just far more focused. And as a result of that, we're getting done at least at a point where we have this draft recommendation done earlier than a lot of the other panels have really even had a chance to get through thinking about where to focus in on. So with that, I will say that, there still is going to be time where the chairs are going to be working to put together the final ask and how to position it with the Spark Executive Committee. So it could be that they reach back to the panel for their thoughts at that point. And then once the Spark Executive Committee starts looking at the recommendations from this panel in the context of the limited funds that they have to allocate and request from the other panels, pretty good chance that they may come back to each one of the panels with questions or requests. So this may very well not be the last time this panel is asked to meet. But this certainly is a point at which, the discussions over the last 5 weeks or so have kind of come together, hopefully in a way that everyone feels good about in terms of what the recommendations would be. So with that, enough preamble, let me get into it. On this slide, once again, the goal today, review and agree on the panel's justification for the funding asks. And discuss the summary output, those key messages for the executive committee, and there could be some other sessions going forward as needed. Go to the next slide. Very quickly, the advisory panel, the outputs of it are really around the programmatic definitions and then the justifications for each programmatic area, and then the scope of the asks. And so that's what's reflected in this document. Next slide. I have probably, one thing to keep in mind on this slide was that, the approach across all the panels, it doesn't necessarily fit this panel in the same way that it does other panels. But the target output of the advisory panel is recommended portfolios for funding at a programmatic level. However, the submissions, fall into those programmatic areas. So the intent is that the submissions could travel as appropriate in the context of the programmatic areas. But, eventually, it will need to go into an agency that is going to be looking at procurement. This particular strategy is an interesting one in that it's going to play out over time and be, from a project by project perspective, so unique to each geography that it would actually be pretty hard to kind of like pen in a lot of the specific projects right now and to put them in a time sequence. There's going to need to be some flexibility around that anyway. The match requirements could look different from geography to geography, depending upon the household density and other issues. So there does need to be some programmatic flexibility in this case, but so long as it's in line with the guidelines that the panel is setting out here. So enough of that. Going into the next slide around the output that would go to the Spark Executive Committee. Go to the next slide. So once again, the process we went through, we reviewed the programmatic areas and we started with the 4 pillars that were in the Kansas broadband strategy, really focused in on infrastructure and affordability and accessibility, and got people's input and discussed ways of making sure that the program each one is as successful as possible. And we use that to develop the programmatic ask for Spark and some of the guiding principles around how it should be implemented that you'll see on the following slides. go to the next slide. And so on this one, I think we should have some discussion where one of the asks that we had was against, or a couple, with regards to broadband infrastructure and adoption and enablement, was when these, well, one, just in terms of making sure that we're as successful as possible in this area, getting input from the panelists, and we got separate input from all of them, and then summarized it here around what we could do to make sure that each one of those programs is as high impact as possible, is as feasible as possible, and represents the equity viewpoint that we want to have with this process. And also, if we get an allocation of say 100 million, how do we split that between broadband infrastructure and adoption enablement? I think it might be easier, rather than me to try and read all these pieces out, is maybe I'll give everyone maybe about 2 or 3 minutes just to look through it. And, let's have a discussion around that in terms of whether folks feel this is kind of representative, or might even still have some suggestions around it. And also kind of how they think about that 85-15 split. Once again, that's at a very gross level. There may be some areas where you only need 5% applied to adoption enablement. There'll be some situations where it may be more. So that is an area where we need some flexibility, and that's somewhat represented here. So anyway, I'll let people read through this, and then let's have a discussion. So I guess if I were to start, just open the discussion, let's take maybe broadband infrastructure and, the comments there around basically recommendations around how to approach it from an impact, feasibility, and equity standpoint. Any thoughts? Anything missing?
I have a comment, John. Senator Hawk here.
Yes, Senator Hawk.
I especially like that comment about future proofing. I know we've talked about that and making sure. And again, I think the robust fiber is a critical part of that future proofing. There may be some other technologies that we need to use in some of the lower density areas. But I think making sure that what we put in is going to be good a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, so that we have predictability for further investment, and there will be further investment. And certainly this isn't the only, as we say in some other parts of this, under feasibility, there are other pots of money that both the 85 million that we invested as a legislature in the broadband office for that plan, but other money that's going to come. And then the other comment I would make, and I certainly trust the Office of Broadband to continue to do what they did with the last COVID money, the 60 million we did through Spark a year ago, in terms of being able how to set priorities, et cetera. But I want to make sure we're not just thinking of unconnected rural areas. I think we have some suburban areas that need better connectivity too. And I would make sure that while I think our rural areas are probably the most obvious high need areas, but there are several areas, for example, in my district that don't have adequate bandwidth. So I would just make those comments about the infrastructure, but I really like what I'm seeing here on the screen.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else?
Hey, John, this is Jeff Wick. So the co-investment under the feasibility, which I like, it looks like we're recommending some feasibility. It could be kind of a sliding scale from, in a more densely populated, could be a 50% match, to a less densely populated area could be 20%. I just want to make sure I was understanding what I was reading. And again, I do like having that flexibility, or proposing that flexibility.
Yeah, it would be a sliding scale, and that would be somewhat situationally dependent upon just what the market is there, and what probably the household density is, right? And probably some other considerations as well.
Okay.
Hey, John, I know Dan has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, I can't see you. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you, Senator Peterson. Good morning. So a couple thoughts. I agree with Senator Hawk's summary on percentages look pretty good. We should focus on future proofing. I generally would want to strike the for example 100 by 100. I think that's not really in line with the strategy with fiber, and really is going to limit our ability to look towards a scalable future. I think the broadband infrastructure piece here, the 85 to 90%, the bigger piece here, really needs to have a subset of items under it. I think this is a little broad yet. I know we talked a little bit about, and Senator Hawk mentioned, alternative technologies are an important part of the process, and providing a little more guidance as to what percentage that would be inside of this larger kind of macro piece of the pie here, I think would be really helpful. I think we've talked a little bit about really a similar allocation within the infrastructure piece of 80 to 90% focused towards fiber, 10% or so focused towards alternative technologies that are typically lower cost, but not as scalable. And then I would also add, and this is just a suggestion. I mean, if we looked at about 80% towards fiber, 10% towards alternative, and then 10% towards experimental. I got a chance to visit an amazing precision ag operation in Western Kansas, and they're doing things out there that we're not really thinking about in this panel yet. And without some really creative funding opportunities, I think we're going to box out a really critical piece of our economy, and how that intersects with broadband. And I think we need to allow the industry to experiment a little bit with solutions for economies or markets like precision ag. So that would be my suggestion: 80% on fiber, 10% on alternative, and 10% on experimental. It'd be great to hear what other people think.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Dan. We had even talked about that a little bit ourselves, and we built that thinking into some of the guiding principles that are on some of the following slides around, having some flexibility there. We didn't know if we could necessarily put percentages on it, but I think it's envisioned that, yeah, there would need to be some experimentation we're required, partially because getting the fiber solution to everyone may actually be a delay in terms of time too, right? And so, but I guess I'd continue per Daniel's comment. Anyone else have any thoughts about that?
Hey, John, could I ask Jeff Wick a question?
Sure, go right ahead. You're the chair.
Jeff, you've worked for a couple companies that have been out in the areas of our map that have green, have the fiber installed. What was your take rate? I know you've used grants and loans before, but what was your take rate out in the rural areas?
We normally see 80% plus. So if there's any doubt that the need is there in the remote rural areas, we see starting out about 80% and we'll end up in that 90% tile long term.
Thank you, sir. That's amazing. That's great, though. Thank you.
Hey, John. So a couple things. So on the foundational and connectivity piece, I think quality of life is important to note in there. I don't know how you kind of frame that up, but we pull out economic development, education, health, et cetera. I think quality of life,
Sure.
there's entertainment or other things that are. And I think Jeff does bring up a good point when we talk about how we do some of those cost share things and understanding what those take rates are and the adoptability rates as we build out these networks, and factor that into the percentage match as well. So we just can be aware of that.
Yep. Great. Any other thoughts?
I might add quality of life issue. One of the problems we have statewide is recruitment and retention of young people. We do a great job of educating young people, and I think it was a good point mentioning that what some people may see as education is also communication, or I'm sorry, entertainment is also communication. And young people don't want to stay in a state where they don't have access to social media and some of the entertainment functions.
Sure.
That's a critical piece of our broadband expansion too.
Yeah, good way of thinking about it. Any thoughts, Melinda?
I've got a question.
Go ahead. Sorry, go right ahead.
Well, and this is just me being very new to this whole process of, obviously there's been quite a bit already done with broadband goals and stuff set forth by Kansas. But ultimately it doesn't seem like we've really done much in this group other than point out the obvious. So this was our last meeting potentially. Then what happens? Who is the czar of Kansas broadband, and will determine what projects actually get funded? Because this is so broad. I don't really feel like we've accomplished anything. But.
Who is that who just spoke? Just so I know, I'm in trying to track.
Brian Vogelmore.
Okay, great. Thanks. As far as I know, Melinda is heading up the broadband, Kansas Broadband Agency. But I don't know, Melinda, if you have any way of framing that.
Yes, I would be happy to speak to that. Thanks, Brian. I've never been called a czar before.
Sorry.
But no, you bring up some really valid points. So I can speak to, our intent as an office is to make sure that we involve a process that is completely vetted as we look at making awards. So even in some of the programs that we have in place now, to make decisions on where we make investments, obviously are structured around what the programmatic requirements are. So we would obviously lean in this situation to federal guidance to provide a framework, on different aspects of program. But then we also look at a number of factors that are critical. Geographic dispersion, like where are we making investments? Are we making them in all regions of the state? Did we get applications in all regions of the state? What are the merits of the application at the local level? What's the community impact? And so there are a number of factors beyond the technology that we consider before we make an investment award. The other thing that you bring up is how can we engage folks with different perspectives to make these decisions? And that is also part of the process. We've engaged in our existing programs, we've engaged people from not only telecommunications and broadband experts to look at the technical merits of a project, but we look at the project as a business proposal, right? And so we have people from a variety of walks of life, whether it's economic development at the local level, business development, public works, municipal experience, agriculture, so transportation. So we have folks from a number of sectors involved in making those decisions. And I would like, hopefully we can continue to formalize that. We also, at the end of the process, interview the grant applicants before we make our final determinations. That helps us vet that the proposed project and all the stakeholders that are either co-investing or part of the project are truly committed. And so we go through quite an extensive process before we award, and formalizing that is important to our work, and we want to make obviously the best investment decisions possible. So we avoid unintended biases from our reviewers. We train them on how to review and so forth. So I appreciate you asking the question, because that's not a part of our work that people see. What else?
Well, a follow-up to that then, I mean, is this helpful to helping you make those decisions?
Well, so I think yes, this helps us by putting parameters around where you want to see those investments go. And like Daniel brought up some great points, as did Senator Hawk, around quality of life, and Paul mentioned that as well as investments that we still have yet in terms of what's emerging technology to make. So having some flexibility in terms of how we structure those opportunities. From a programmatic standpoint, I think, as John mentioned, it'd be really challenging to try to drill down on the program specifics, but there are certainly ways for us, whether it's looking at other state programs, at existing state needs, and in different areas of our state economy and local municipal needs, that we can get to that.
That's helpful. And that's just because I don't have a good background in what you guys do. The only thing I'll add is I was visiting with some people within John Deere yesterday down here at the Commodity Classic. And one of the interesting things they said, when Iowa, and this would have been 6 or 7 years ago, went about developing their program, they really had an emphasis not just on connectivity of all households, but really connectivity of every acre, because they're very aware of some of the stuff coming down the pipeline. And it was pretty neat to hear their thoughts about what that might look like. And clearly it was and I appreciate some of Daniel's thoughts. I'm not even sure we really know what that network is going to look like to cover every acre. But we certainly want to make sure, however we invest these dollars in infrastructure right now, that it can be included, so we're not having to rebuild stuff in the future.
Well, I appreciate Brian's comments, and he's a different part of this equation. He's not necessarily the broadband industry. Is representing agriculture, and he's coming into this pretty new, and he made just a very plain observation that we have barely scratched the surface here as far as recommendations how to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and this framework is going to be a framework that's going to be ported into hundreds of millions of more dollars that are going to come in future rounds of funding for broadband. There's over $500 million coming into the state for broadband infrastructure, and we've spent 2.5 meetings talking about some of the most important infrastructure our state's going to put into use for the next decades. And I agree with him. I don't think we've spent enough time on this. I don't think we've gotten deep enough. I know there's probably more slides to talk through, and maybe that'll help. But I really think we will have wasted a lot of stakeholders' time here if we don't take a few more meetings to get a little deeper into what the challenges are, where we want to go. I think it's a mistake to send this back into a vacuum and develop all of the programmatic processes without a lot of not just industry, but entire ecosphere represented here. A lot more input is needed on this, in my opinion.
Hey, Daniel, what are the types of additional questions you would envision answering at the next level of detail?
Well, I hit it a little bit. I mean, we're talking about, the split here of 85 to 90% of broadband infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole list of decision making underneath, what that means, what the priorities are. Is some of this mobility, is all of it fiber? How are we gonna, most states that are ahead of us are using this type of panel to formulate a more detailed plan. I mean, they're not writing the rules, but they're writing a lot more detail, and I mean, there are states that are already allocating money. We don't even have an official broadband plan on the books right now, and I think those kinds of things need to be brought up and discussed by this committee. And again, there's been very little input. I mean, there's a lot of people on this call. A lot of them haven't provided any input on the call that I've heard. Maybe they're doing it offline, but I don't feel like we're finished here.
Okay. I would say Senator Peterson, Melinda, the chairs, your thoughts about that. I mean, we could continue, by the way, through this and see what level of detail this gets to, but I'd leave it up to you to decide kind of if we go somewhere next on this, where you'd want to go.
Like on one of the points that I believe Daniel brought up earlier on the 100 by 100, I think in that area, we need to make sure that whatever we do is scalable. It was just 2 years ago, we were talking about 25/3 as being a top deal. And, now we got cable companies that are delivering gigabit over the cables. And, we get down to 100 by 100, we may get stuck into technology that's not scalable in the future. So we could get a little more detail on.
We lost you again, Senator Peterson.
I think that was kind of assumed that, it was going to be scalable, but we want to make sure that people know that. I'm having trouble with my microphone, so I'll let it go.
I guess, Melinda, how far, in terms of like the next level of definition, where would you envision the panel being able to go, that it would be able to weigh in on with enough specificity at this point? that would be kind of helpful for the broadband deployment.
Well, certainly, as Daniel mentioned, if there's a desire to explore emerging or, unproven technology, it would be beneficial to identify a pilot opportunity. So that could be beneficial in the sense that it gives us permission to experiment with unproven technologies. From an alternative perspective, I guess I'm a little reluctant to say we want to specify a specific amount when you have more latitude, to do some alternative technology or hybrid types of solutions within the infrastructure definition. Now, I mean, we want it to be robust. Maybe I know that the NTIA and the Treasury are staying fairly technology agnostic, and that although they, obviously they publish minimum expectations, which is what the 100 likely represents there. But certainly scalable, as Senator Peterson has consistently pointed out, that's really critical for our work. So that would be my feedback. And I see Jeff has his hand up.
Hey, a couple of comments that I would make, and I agree on because we just have 100 by 100 in there. I think we ought to have a minimum of 100 by 100 scalable to 1 gig in that parentheses, because saying 100 by 100 means that's all you have to meet, and certainly these are one kind of lifetime investments. In my opinion, we need to take advantage of those and ensure that we're not just building it for today, which I think 100 by 100 is today. We need to build that long term down the road. The other thing I would say on the equity side is, and this is bigger picture, and I understand that, but the other thing I'd say on the equity side, and it's similar to what Melinda just talked about, hey, give permission to do something out of the box, but I don't know if we want to look at mapping or not. I've been in this industry 25 plus years, and I'm not sold that the FCC map is going to be perfect. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and other states like Georgia, Montana have hired a company called Lightbox, and they're doing their own state maps. And I guess when I look at equity, the high need areas, and we discuss that, but how do we define those? And I'm not saying we do a map. I'm saying the permission to look at doing our own state map, because certainly that's going to make this overall be able to focus those dollars in the most efficient. And if a map costs $5 million, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and that helps us really define the areas that absolutely need it. I'm just throwing that out there in the discussion. The other thing I'd say is, to Daniel's point, it depends what the intention is. If our intention here is to set, the rails and the guidelines going forward, then you're giving that trust into, in this case, the Kansas Office of Broadband. And certainly, our background with interfacing with them and grant applications has been nothing but positive. So certainly, in our case, we would have a great trust that they're going to take these, guidelines and use those appropriately within the grant distribution.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Brad Gear from Witt O'Brien's. Good morning to the chairs, members of the panel. I just wanted to sort of tag on that and explain that understand exactly that given the importance of this issue, that everybody would love to dive down deeper, spend a lot more time on it. The reason that we're trying to keep it at this level, one of the reasons is these are federal dollars, and there's an expectation that there will be an open and competitive grant making process, as there have been for other funding resources. And frankly, the program won't work unless some of our panel members are grant applicants. So we want to be able to make sure that we don't get too far into that discussion to where people might raise questions about the open and competitive fairness of the process. So that's why we've tried to keep it high level. There's a lot of scrutiny on all these dollars. As Jeff pointed out, the Office of Broadband Development has done a number of grant making programs that I think have built their credibility. And the things that we're hearing, while we may not be asking the committee, the panel to sort of dive down formally deeper, it's all things that will be wrapped into the program design. And I think when you see that, you'll see your inputs were not wasted, they did not fall on deaf ears, and that actually the program, if the Spark Executive Committee gives any funding to this, will certainly reflect that. And not just this program, but all the broadband funding, because we've learned a lot about how we can build that into a program design. And again, would echo Jeff's sentiments of trusting Office of Broadband Development and the Commerce Department to be able to run a good program that meets those needs.
Well, all the points taken. We just had that whole discussion around the broadband infrastructure piece. Wonder whether people have any other additional thoughts around the adoption enablement piece in terms of, once again, just flying at this level right here on this slide for now. Is there anything missing here or that seems off that people have thought about as they look through it?
Hey, John, it's Paul. My only thought was, there's other programs out there helping with this too. The ACP is one, and I know there's companies that are helping with this area too. So as we come out of the gate, and I agree with what the teams are saying about the strategy and how we go forward. And really what we're doing, what I see, and I think what Brian was going to, is I'm hoping that folks take the work we're doing and then incorporate into their decision making as well as we get more funding. And so I think it's going to, and I think I brought this up on another call, is what do we want to do this first go around with Spark, right? How quick do we need to move? I know we want to move quickly, but I also know we want to make the right decisions for the taxpayers' dollars, right? So I don't want to get stuck on, we can't make a decision on the Spark funding in order to get down to more detail of how we vision this thing going forward, right? I just want to be cautious of that.
Yep. Thanks. Any other thoughts on this? Jeff?
Hey, John, the question I had, and I again agree, flexibility, we have 85, 95, and then 515. I assume that's how we would propose that. So there'd be flexibility to move those percentages.
The official ask would be at an 85-15 split.
Okay, it would actually be okay.
But realizing that we'd have flexibility situationally within that, depending on the situation.
Well, I think the reason I bring that up is just like Paul mentioned, there's been a tremendous amount of money in there coming into adoption, and I agree we need it. And I foresee more and more coming through E-rate programs, those type of things. So so having the flexibility to me makes sense in those areas.
Yeah. Okay. Senator Hawk?
Yeah, I wanted to second what Paul said. I don't want to get into paralysis by analysis and get so hung up on the detail. I'm not questioning that there needs to be detailed work. I personally trust the Office of Broadband to have a fair procurement process. And I think the biggest thing we could do to hurt this, when I look at what's going on nationally and supply chain issues and really what's happening on the international stage with Russia and Ukraine, I think we need to get a decision and get down the road and start getting the broadband build out. Obviously, to me, the biggest need is right up there and getting our infrastructure going. And I think we know how to do that. And I think we have providers in the state that know how to do that. And I think our big decision is to get an ask in, and hopefully, I know as we go on to the other slides, I think you were asking for about 170 million on the broadband and maybe 30 on the adoption enablement, but somewhere in that $200 million range. I'd be okay with more, but at least get a decision, and let's get the procurement process going, and pressure Spark Executive Committee and State Finance Council to make some decisions, because I think this area of connectivity is the most critical decision we need to move on right now of all 4 subcommittees, in my opinion. So I don't want to get so bogged down in the detail that we could spend another year on the detail and then miss the boat. So thanks.
Hey, John, just to throw this out, if we only got 100 million, would the percentages be the same as if we had 200 million for the adoption?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this area. Personally, I wasn't really sure because
I don't know what the committee felt. I thought that's why we had the 5 to 15 down there. If we got 200 million, we could still have, maybe the same amount for adoption, but put more into the broadband infrastructure side if we got more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is when we even talk about how much is in the broadband infrastructure side, we're not even sure how many households that necessarily gets you once you take into account co-investment, right? So, hopefully there is a pretty good leverage effect on these dollars.
May want to go to the next slide, John, but as
Sure.
we do that, just in follow up to the senator's point, the flexibility is there, that 85, 15, 80, 20 mirrors the overall portfolio of all funding that comes in for broadband, but there's no reason that separate funding sources couldn't vary from that. So if you wanted to change the percentage from with 100 million to be a different percentage than the $200 million ask, I think that would be perfectly reasonable and acceptable.
Yeah, on this, the slide that's in front of you now basically has at the highest level, the components of the ask. And there's more detail on the following slides around it. But basically it's talking about the 2 pillars somewhat distinctly, but acknowledging the fact that they're really linked. And so if you get 100, you will need to spend in both buckets. Not exactly sure what the exact percentage is going to be. That's going to play out depending upon which projects are taken up where. And same thing, if you get 200, there would be a split. But this isn't necessarily, in my mind, indicating that if you got 200, you would spend 170 million to the dollar on infrastructure and 30 million to the dollar on the enablement side. I don't know if anyone would have anything to add to that.
Hey, so John, is that on this current request we're talking about, the current grants that are out there, or the current ideas that are out there? Because I don't even know, do we have the 15 million on it, and then on the adoption side in this request?
You don't know if we have.
I haven't gone through and categorized it that way, so I just don't know what we're going to be looking at.
Oh, you're saying, is this looking at the submissions?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, this was saying, look, we use the submissions as a way of being able to shape these requests, but it isn't scaling the size of each bucket using the submissions themselves. The size of those buckets was scaled using somewhat the submissions, but probably more so the experience of the panel and of the Office of Broadband Development.
Got it. And then this is off topic slightly, but do we know what the total submissions are for the Spark program in general?
Overall, for all of, well, the available Spark funds at this point to be dispersed potentially is a minimum of 721 million.
But,
If you look at
what's been
all the-
requested?
Yeah, if you look at all the submissions that came in across the 4 panels, it's about $12.8 billion of submissions, but they don't even necessarily reflect everything because the panels themselves can brainstorm on things outside of the submissions, right? So if there's an area that's really important to address, but there weren't a whole lot of submissions that were significant there still could be other ideas that come in. So a lot more submission volume, but once again, some of those were very high level ideas in terms of funding requests and what's available.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Any other thoughts on this slide in terms of either how it's laid out here or the splits, the amounts? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, just to be clear, the ask would be 200 million, with acknowledging that there would be some split, with the minimum being 100, saying that we just couldn't envision going below that. There is a little bit of a dynamic here too, that I think in some people's mind, they're thinking some of the coming bills like infrastructure is going to be a very, very rich opportunity for funding here, and others aren't quite sure yet, given the level of uncertainty around them. And so there is a little bit of that calculus at play here. All right, well, in the interest of kind of continuing to give people kind of the full idea of what this is, let me go through. So this is the overview for broadband infrastructure investments. I won't read through the pieces. Why don't people kind of take a look and see whether this makes sense and reflects. Hey, Brad, could you take over this for a second? I need to take a call that I'm getting right now. Sorry about that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to defer this to Melinda, who I think is the best to talk about how we've taken that input and how she would propose to use these considerations in running the program. Melinda?
Yeah, so I think there was robust discussion on just these 3 priorities earlier in our conversation. Senator Hawk mentioned specifically the scalable nature of what we're prioritizing, as well as the need to make sure that we position our communities for future investment. And that's really what this is all about as we look to try to connect everyone. So the priority in terms of connecting all Kansans obviously also gets at the need to make sure that everyone has access to the infrastructure, as well as access to connect from a digital literacy and adoption standpoint, whether that's affordability or just knowing how to physically make a connection. And then finally, the priority is to ensure that we appropriate the funding in areas of need. And as we discussed last time, have planned to co-invest at different rates based on the local, the local need. So I think we really had some robust conversation, and all of you have had significant input into these areas.
Thanks, Melinda. I just want to add a couple of thoughts to that. One, you'll notice on the top one that we put in the verbiage, utilize best available technology instead of future proofing. I just am a little concerned about, as fast as the technology is changing, seeing what they're trying to do in places like Ukraine right now, low Earth orbit satellites and whatever may come. we may not be able to future-proof it, but we definitely get the point that we want to make investments in the best available, recognized technology and keep ourselves flexible for others that come along. And on the second one, I really liked what I heard earlier. Maybe, Melinda, we should be changing this to say, connect all Kansans and every Kansas acre or something like that. I really like that side of it, because we've heard so much talk about other things like precision agriculture. And I remember when a year ago, we're talking with the education secretary about broadband and the dream of the kids being able to be driving down highways in Kansas, going to a football game and doing their homework. Maybe a bigger leap to get the kids to do their homework while driving down the highways, but having all those acres connected so that they could do things like that, I think is really where we want to be. So I think that's a great addition.
Can I say something about that? I like that as a goal. I'm not sure we have enough money, even with all the pots coming in, to make that happen. I want to make sure we get the biggest bang for the buck. I think that's a big goal, but I know there are areas, even in my neck of the woods here in eastern Kansas, that the population density, we could easily spend a large percent of this money, but our impact in terms of effectiveness would not be as great as. So I think you have to moderate that in terms of where do we get the biggest bang for the buck and make an impact.
Agreed. And it's really aspirational, just to make sure we don't forget about that important component of it. But definitely, senators, we've talked about, this is just connecting the household is $1 billion plus challenge. And we probably, best case, have half of that potentially coming in, maybe a little bit more. So connecting those Kansans is first and foremost. Jeff, you've got a thought?
I would just point out, I agree, getting fiber further out into all the remote rural areas, but there is also a mobility fund out there for mobility technology. And I don't think it's a lot. I don't think it's enough, but there is some dollars in that specifically for precision agriculture. I think it's a very low amount, but understand there are other funds too that would potentially help with some of what you were talking about, Brad.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Let's maybe then go to the next slide, because this is really sort of the meat of the actual pure ask, and where we would want to, we want to get the specific thoughts from the panel on, is this the right amount? And recognizing, again, this panel is a little bit different. So why 100 million to 200 million instead of 50 million to 500 million? A lot of it is the guidelines going in where the bottom range should be sort of the lowest amount that makes sense. You can't run a viable program with less money. But we know that's not going to be the case in broadband, because when we got $50 million, thanks to the Spark process on CRF dollars, we put it to good use. So if you give, if you see that the Office of Broadband Development has $5 million a year from the acceleration grant program, they're putting that to good use. So there really is no feasible bottom range. They'll take whatever we can do, chips away at the problem. And the upper range, really, frankly, is just looking at that $720 million, whatever it may be, compared to the billions of dollars asked, and just recognizing probably realistically getting a quarter of the funds would be a great outcome. So that's where that sort of those bounds came from. Love to get try to see if we can finalize some thoughts here on this slide. If we think the right amount for asking for infrastructure is bounded by 85 on the low side, 170 on the high side, and this is the form that would go forward. Templates have been developed for all of the different panels, so they all look alike, and it really, the justification comes down to the equity, the ability to actually do the projects, the realistic of it, the sustainability. All that's really easy in broadband compared to a lot of the projects in the other groups. So I think to the chairs, this is where we'd want to try to finalize on the broadband infrastructure piece.
I had one thought, and I'm guessing if you're trying to make this parallel with all four groups, And we don't really know what the other three groups are generally looking at, other than I think, didn't I hear there was like $12 billion of asks if you looked at all four groups? Is that right, Brad?
Yeah, that's what John was saying, 12.8 billion.
Is it possible to have three asks? You know, the minimum, a medium target and a high target? Because I could see us easily asking for 250 to 300 million, because what we're doing, my guess is going to affect those other three areas. If we're in health area, we need more broadband if we want our hospitals to be able to function remotely. If there's education asks, again, we need more broadband if we want our education system. If there's business, clearly, and those other, and I don't remember the exact name of all the other three areas, but it would seem in our particular case, having a high, medium, and low ask might make it more likely that we get the medium, looking at the politics of it, but might also mean that as they look at everything, maybe we want to make that extra investment in connectivity because it will help the other three areas. So just my initial thinking.
Hey, this is Jeff. Where I like that idea. The other thought I had written down was, do we have the target at 200 million and the minimum? I think 85 is way too low, whether that's 100 or 125 million. If we keep the two, I just think we need to increase that. And if for some reason, you know, they go to the lower, I think 85 million is really low for everything that we can do. As Senator Hawk mentioned on the, you know, this is all interrelated, but again, a thought, but maybe the three levels is a better strategy.
Hi, folks. Claire Huddling here, working with John, the RO, and KOBD to help run the advisory panel process writ large and helping particularly for connectivity. Thank you so much for this feedback. I think we can speak with John and the Spark process around whether we can include a high, medium, low recommendation in line with the discussion we have here today. Ultimately, it's up to the Spark EC to determine what the final amounts would be. And they would also have purview to potentially invest more money beyond an ask. So even if we came in, even if we were only making a minimum and a target request, they may even be able to come in higher. So we'll be happy to take this offline and talk through.
But I think I would echo some of the other thoughts on the minimum ask is too low. You know, I think it should be somewhere up in the mid hundreds, and the funding ask, I think an easy number would be 200. It's a fourth of the total. And then you know, another area I think that would be important for this, and you know, I appreciate the comments related to, hey, let's not get into the weeds. You know, I think some of that commentary is just based on, you know, overall urgency, and I think that was reflected here. So I think on one side, the argument is don't get in the weeds so we can do this in a hurry. The other side of the argument is, hey, we need to get in the weeds to solve the problem. And so I think maybe the middle ground here, and maybe something to emphasize in this slide is some sort of deadline for the administrative part of this process to, you know, or a goal. You know, maybe a goal's better worded than a deadline of like, hey, when do we want to try to allocate this, and when do we want to actually get it put to work. And I know some of that goes beyond, what we're recommending here, but I think there's consensus that we need to get this money put to work. And if we don't focus on that, we could continue to fall behind in our efforts here.
Great point, Daniel. And the answer of when is really dependent on how long it takes the Spark Executive Committee to go through their process. As you know, Office of Broadband Development has done several programs already. We are currently in the process of doing the preliminary program design for the next phases that'll be funded by multiple federal sources. And we're just waiting for the final inputs from this committee, which we've been getting. But I think it's really weeks, not months, after approval from the Spark Committee, the authorization to spend the funds, that this would be out for the competitive grant process. So I don't think there are going to be any delays on the side of OBD once the funding gets approved.
Yeah, I think it may be just a request up to the Spark Committee to issue some deadlines to get it spent once it's allocated. I think that's an important incentivizing factor in the work here.
And we know that the federal program itself comes with a deadline that's still a few years out, which makes sense because some of the projects may take longer, but absolutely the intent is to award the projects as soon as good grant applications are received. And then just like we worked with you and others on the CRF funded projects, we want to make sure that all the grantees have realistic and aggressive timelines of getting the projects done once they're awarded. So 100% agreed. So what's the sense then on this ask for really for both? Does everybody seem to be general consensus that the minimum should be 100, the maximum would be 200, and that the 85-15 split makes general sense?
I'm going to weigh in again. If we can have three, I'd like the high to be 250 to 300, and I'd actually like the target ask. If we have to have two, I'd sort of want the target ask to be 250 and the minimum to be 150. So and I know that's more than quote our fair share, but I don't think we should assume that the money needs to be divided equally between all four groups. I think that's going to be a Spark Committee decision. And if you ask for low, you're not going to get high.
Absolutely. So I think, just probably the range, whatever range you think is appropriate. So if you want to up the minimum and up the maximum, or hold the minimum and put in a higher maximum, frankly, as you know, the executive panels also have got the discretion to fall anywhere within or around those bounds. So the bottom really is, if you think it's just asking for too little, could certainly be bumped up a bit. But I think all we need to do is bring forward a range and then let them sort of balance that against the other needs. So you're suggesting a higher top end range to 250 or 300, Senator?
Yes, would like to know how the rest of the group might weigh in on that.
I think that's a great suggestion. And I like Senator Hawk's point on 3. If we have to keep it in the framework of this, 250 is the target, 150 is the minimum, I think would be great and important.
Just want to be cautious on the bottom end of it, so that, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there's this thought that anything below the bottom end is not sort of worth the effort. We don't want to leave the impression that if we don't get 150 and all they have is 100, that we wouldn't want it. So just want to make sure you think through exactly how that works. I get all the considerations, just want to, not knowing what the executive panel is going to be looking at, don't want to close ourselves out if it gets down to there's only $100 million, but maybe that's not an issue.
Add to that, my apologies, Senator. Just to add to that, and this is Dr. Anderson, Topeka Public Schools. I agree wholeheartedly with Senator Hawks and other comments in that I don't understand necessarily why. I understand the minimum, and whatever you said, that the minimum is the minimum. You can say anything on the minimum, but to me, a maximum, you're then cutting off what you can get, and so the opportunity lies before us to be as thoughtful in that maximum number, to me more so than adjusting the minimum. That's one thought. I did want to speak to the split that you that have referenced, and I personally like the split. I saw someone in the comment mention 10%, but whether it's 10%, nothing less than that, or 15%, just language matters, and that digital literacy piece, as well as just addressing the affordability and the access in that regard, and specifically allowing communities to tailor that because they're so different. I appreciate that, love how that is split out, but would say that nothing less than 10%. And if you leave it 5 to 15, that's fine. Because again, I think the minimum to me doesn't really matter. The maximum to me is what matters. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. So, John, where we've come down is there's a sentiment that we should raise the upper end, maybe leave the lower end at 100, just so that people don't think we wouldn't take it if it was all that was available. But maybe raise the upper end to 300 to send the executive committee that message that this is super important and we need that money desperately. And then it sounds like there's still some strong sentiment. The 85-15 split makes some decent sense. So wasn't sure, John, on whether this is something that you want the group through the chairs to vote on or do by consensus, or it sounds like we're coalescing around somewhere from 250 to 300 on the top end, and maybe 100's okay on the bottom end, and 85-15-ish sounds about where people are comfortable.
I would leave that up to the chairs in terms of, how you want to approach that.
Senator Peterson, any thoughts on how we sort of formalize the ask from this group?
Seeing a lot in the chats around the 250 range, and and then I saw the comment on the 90-10. If you get up into the 300 range, you can have a little less in your adoptability, but I agree. You if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. But we don't want to go too high on our minimum viable. That's my concern on minimum viable. I do think it should be at least 100. I see a lot of people out there saying 100 to 150.
So, Senator, how would you like to sort of formalize this? We've got really just need to come up with a way to pin this down now. If you wanted to take a vote or propose something and see if everybody's generally in agreement with that.
I don't know if you wanted to put it in the chat or just let them send it in on an exit survey, however you want to do it. It's good with me. Or Melinda, unless you have ideas.
Yes, if we're needing this today, I would ask Brad, John, do we need this today? Then we may want to take a vote on whether the minimum should be 100 or 150, and then whether the top end should be 250 or 300, which seem to be where we landed. We could certainly take a vote on those specific amounts.
I don't think we necessarily need it exactly today, but if in the interest of transparency, people want to have a vote 100 versus 150 on the lower end or 200 versus 250 on the higher end, we could certainly do that.
Can I ask a question? There's kind of a key word there on viable. And I think we're kind of worried if our minimum viable was 150, might we get 0 because people would say, well, we just don't have that, so you're not going to get anything. I don't think that's going to be the case in terms of the Spark Committee. I would guess the Spark Committee believes that connectivity is a high priority area. So I don't know if we have a huge risk And certainly for me, 100 would be if it's minimum viable, I think that's 100 is there, but I'm comfortable going with 150 and 250 or even 150 and 300, knowing that the Spark is going to adjust that. And I also think the question I asked in our last meeting is what would it take us to get to every household? And I think I heard an estimate of 1.2 billion. So, and that's not doing every acre. That's household. So when we look at what our need is and the fact that we need to probably be there in Kansas, if we want to have a economy that can play with the rest of the country, it puts that in perspective. I think that 150 and 300 or 150 and 250 is not really out of line for where we need to be.
Yeah, but the one thing to keep in mind is on that overall number too, I'm not sure that really is contemplating the co-investment, right? So I'm not sure that that's a apples to apples against this request, right? Because this is the pure state level funding.
Agree.
Okay. We could, I mean, if it's cleaner, we could just do a post survey and ask people on that if they're okay with that, and we'll get it out to everyone. Are people comfortable with that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So the post survey, John, would be the choices of the minimum of 100, 150, choices of the upper level of 200, 250, 300.
Sure.
And then maybe choices of 85, 85, 15, 90, 10, something like that.
Yeah.
Great.
Great. All right. So where were we? Sorry about that.
Well, I think we're really to the next section because we've talked through all of these issues. The next two slides are really the same thing on the broadband enhancement piece, but I think we've sort of hit that split and the amount. So maybe we're to the next step section, John, for you.
Yeah. Okay. So on the next, so go to the next slide. I mean, this is basically the next steps where, early April, the intent is for the panel chairs to present the recommendations and have a discussion with the Spark Executive Committee. And then the Spark Executive Committee is likely going to be getting, say, $1.5 to $2 billion of asks, probably more in the 1.5 range. And they're going to need to be able to make some trade-offs. And so they're going to start working through a process, but will likely, potentially have questions that would go back and forth, certainly to the chairs and potentially to the panels if the chairs so decide. So that's why I hedged a little bit in the April timeframe. This may not be the last meeting for sure. And that I think it was Senator Hawks' comment, whereas where I'd envision, they wouldn't say, oh, okay, your minimum was 150 and we would have rather given you 125, so you get zero. There would be obviously that kind of massaging going back and forth to make sure that the overall calculus fit right. So I don't necessarily see a big risk, as big a risk there either. But this is the process going forward with the goal of an early to mid-May. The Spark Executive Committee would have their integrated slate that they'd be able to put forward to the State Finance Council. Go to the next slide. And as I think I just talked through this, the Spark Executive Committee is just looking at in an integrated sense, may likely come back to the chairs or maybe even to the panels themselves if the chairs want to pull them back together to talk about or provide input on the specifics of the recommendations. So there may be some things that they have uncertainty around or want specified more, as well as around the asks themselves. Go to the next slide. So once again, the next steps really would be the Spark Executive Committee reaching out with any additional questions and panels being notified once the final recommendation is being made. But I'd say, we've added a step here where we're going to need to, have some voting on, those different levels. And, we can do that in an exit survey and then report back to people and kind of reflect that and the comments that we got today as appropriate, working with the chairs into this document and give people a view of that. Does that make sense to folks?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, Melinda's got a thumbs up. Okay, appreciate it. Awesome. Well, once again, thanks to everyone, and I do want to acknowledge what folks said is that, there still is a lot to be done on an ongoing basis around this at a more detailed level, but, some of those things would be pretty hard to be able to answer on a fixed basis at this point in time. And even if you could, I think some of those would still be tentative because they change as the situation changes over time. But anyway, thank you everyone for your, all the time that you spent on this. Everyone's got day jobs, super busy. So really appreciate that. I don't know if the chairs have anything else that they'd like to add.
I'd like to encourage everyone to watch for the exit survey and be sure you fill them out. It's very important on this one.
Great.
Indeed. Thank you all again for your contributions and your continued input. We look forward to seeing where we land. I think, Daniel, to some of the points you made, we all feel a sense of urgency about this work. And I just want to thank everyone for bringing their specific expertise to the table so that we collectively can solve this problem. So thank you all.